Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, the Multicenter AIDS Cohort Study, Women's Interagency HIV Study Combined Cohort Study, supported by the GSA Innovation Fund. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the GSA website. A notice to all attendees will be distributed once the recording is available. Today's program is the first in a series of 5 webinars on HIV and aging, data access, availability, and research funding opportunities. If you haven't already registered, please go to geron.org/webinars for information about this webinar series. A question and answer session will immediately follow the live presentation. We'll be accepting questions through the questions feature that's accessible on the GoToWebinar panel. Also located there are downloadable handouts for today, a copy of the presentation slides, and a sample combined cohort study concept sheet submission form. Today's presentation will be given by Deborah Gustafson, co-principal investigator at the Brooklyn Clinical Research Site of the MWCCS. Thank you, Deb, for bringing us this important program.
Thank you very much. And thank you everybody today for joining us to discuss a little bit about the MWCCS. I want to introduce you to the cohort today, as well as give you some information related to your potential involvement as a researcher in the MWCCS. So the MWCCS was officially funded last year, and it is the combination of 2 cohorts which have been following men and women with and without HIV infection for over 25 years. And so these 2 cohorts are illustrated on this slide. One is the Multicenter AIDS Cohort Study, we abbreviate as the MACS, and the other is the Women's Interagency HIV Study, or the WIHS. So the inception of the MACS was in 1983, and the WIHS 10 years later in 1993. Next slide, please. So we are now funded for another 7 years to continue to follow up both cohorts in a merged form, which means that we are going to be entertaining and using a combined protocol. And so this is just an outline over the next 7 years that participants will be seen annually. Up until this point, they've actually been seen every 6 months. So we're going to be seeing them annually, and they will be completing a variety of different assessments, as well as completing a variety of different surveys, and also blood samples, urine, etc. Next slide. So this is a picture of where the MWCCS clinical sites are in the United States. And as you can see, they tend to overlap with areas of the US where HIV prevalence is the highest. Those areas are indicated by the darkest red regions. And these are the sites comprised of both women and men's historic sites. So I'm going to point out, first of all, just the men's sites because there are fewer of them. But the MACS traditionally had sites and will continue to have sites in Los Angeles, Chicago, Pittsburgh, and Baltimore. And the WIHS comprises the rest of the sites in addition to having a site in Chicago. So there's an overlap there. Johns Hopkins University is the data analysis and coordination center for the MWCCS. We fondly refer to that as the DAC. And the MWCCS is governed by a 57-member executive committee, which is comprised of the principal investigators, as well as the project directors. And we have over 30 scientific and operative working groups. So because of the breadth and the depth of the information collected within the MWCCS and historically in the MACS and WIHS, these working groups represent that. And I'll share a little bit more detail about that with you in a minute. Next slide. So I'd like to begin a little bit by telling you about our participants. And so these are our active participants. There are a little over 4,000 of them that have been seen at the close of the MACS and the WIHS cohorts as independent cohorts. The next slide, please. And the first slide is a flow diagram of the WIHS, and I have a similar one for the MACS that's included in this presentation, so you can look at these later. But what you'll see is that in the former WIHS cohort, there have been a total of almost 5,000 women enrolled over time. And then we follow up both the women and the men. As you see here, the men, that's fine, for for AIDS, incidence of AIDS, as well as mortality. And we're linked to the National Death Index, and so therefore we're able to adequately understand who is alive in our cohort over time and whether they have developed an AIDS defining illness. One thing that I will say is that the cohorts have been replenished over time due to the earlier mortality that was experienced in both cohorts due to HIV infection. Next slide. Given that the MACS Combined Cohort Study is a longitudinal study of individuals, and particularly today we have participants who have what we call chronic HIV infection. That means that they were infected 10 to 20 to 30 years ago and have survived to this point due to the success of antiretroviral therapies. As a result of this, the cohort has proceeded to age. And so that's why it's very interesting from the standpoint of understanding aging biology, particularly aspects of that biology that do relate to infection, immunology, inflammatory mechanisms, that this cohort is extremely valuable. So you can see that the men are about 10 years older than the women. The men with HIV infection are median age 58, without infection 63, and the women with HIV infection are average age 52 and without age 50. And you can see as well here that the prevalence of individuals or participants who are at least age 60 years and older are predominant in the men. 64% of those without infection are over at least age 60 or older, and 42% of the men with infection. And there's lower proportions seen in the women. And the reason why the men have a higher proportion of older men amongst the negatives is that the MACS was originally created as a cohort of high-risk individuals. So these were primarily a group of men who have sex with men who are at very high risk of HIV infection back in the 80s. And the initial purpose of the cohort was actually to follow incidence, HIV incidence. And so now we've developed past that, and we're now interested more in the chronic disease space and understanding the interplay between infectious disease over time with aging-related chronic disease factors. Next slide. I wanted to share with you a few demographic factors as well as some chronic disease indicators, and that's what the next two slides are going to be about. You'll see the age repeated here in this table, but I just wanted to let you know that the majority of our women participants in the WIHS are African American or Black, around 75%, whereas the majority of the men are of white ancestry. And the median follow-up time for all groups except for HIV negative men is around 16 to 17 years. And of course, the follow-up for the HIV negative men is longer because of that initial way that the participants were recruited back in the 80s. Next slide, please. We also measure not only infectious disease factors, but chronic disease indicators, as I mentioned. And so I just wanted to point out a few of these to you today. We do have a fairly high prevalence of smoking. You can see 44% of the women without HIV infection actually report current smoking, 34% of the women with HIV infection current smoking, and slightly lower prevalence in the men. Our BMI is rather interesting. The majority of our women are obese, so over half are obese. And of those, and approximately 20% actually meet the criteria for morbid obesity or a BMI of over 40. Whereas the men are on, median, their BMI indicates that they're in the overweight range, which one would expect based on this age of the men. Hypertension is common amongst around half of our participants, and that's defined using both clinical measures as well as or the use of medications. Diabetes is prevalent in around 25% of the women, a lower percentage in the men, and again defined on the basis of the presence of biomarkers or the use of medication. We see dyslipidemia in around a third of the participants overall, comparable percentages in the women and the men, and again those are clinically defined dyslipidemia. And we do have a fairly high prevalence of chronic kidney disease, particularly in the women and men who have HIV infection. And here we see, 14 to 15%. And that is also defined using a biomarker. So we do a lot with the blood samples that we collect, and this is based on EGFR levels being less than 60. And as I mentioned, maybe earlier, I can't remember if I did or not, but we are linked with the National Cancer Institute Surveillance and End Results Registry. And so that we do receive regular updates related to cancer occurrences for both the women and the men. And you can see that cancer occurrence has been higher in those individuals with HIV infection. If you look overall at comparing positives to negatives in both sex groups. And we also keep track of AIDS defining events when it comes to cancers. You can see that listed here. Next slide, please. Since I'm assuming that most of the people on the webinar today are interested in aging, I thought I'd also present to you some data on frailty. These are cross-sectional data from our most recent frailty assessments in the WIHS, where we see even among women who are relatively young, these women would be on average age 50 at the time of these assessments, so late 40s. We see a prevalence of frailty of 10% in those women with HIV infection and 15% in those without. Next slide, please. And this is a schematic, a little bit different type of graph than the previous slide showing you the frailty phenotype in the MACS, where you can see that frailty is experienced or observed more among HIV positive men, less among HIV negative men. We have a prevalence of around 12% in HIV positive men, and that prevalence does increase with age, which is the x-axis here. One thing to mention that I did not yet is that we do use the Fried frailty phenotype to define frailty in both the WIHS and the MACS. And that is a standardized protocol that will continue into the future. And we are using for both of these presented analyses today, the cardiovascular health study cut points for grip strength and for 4-meter walk to be able to define frailty on those two components of the 5 that comprise the Fried frailty phenotype. Next slide, please. Now, since the MWCCS is a study of the natural history of HIV infection, we also collect quite a bit of information related to the medication used to treat it, which are antiretroviral therapies or antiretroviral medications. And you can see that we have a cohort that's very well controlled. So 94% of the women, 94% of the men report currently being on any type of therapy. And they've all been exposed to various, not all, but majority of them have been exposed to other types of therapies over time. And the nature of their disease has been fairly severe. As you can tell, that we have almost 90% of the cohort with HIV infection have experienced CD4 counts less than 500 cells per mil. And a good proportion, 44% of the men, 32%, or 44% of the women and 32% of the men have experienced CD4 counts of less than 200 cells per mil. So this is an interesting cohort from that standpoint and from the infectious disease and immunological hit that they have had during their lifetime. Next slide, please. This is just another pictorial to show you kind of the natural history of treatments in the cohorts over time. So you can see that the majority today are on what are called integrase inhibitor-based regimens, but that various types of regimens have varied over time in terms of their efficacious treatment of HIV infection. One of the areas of interest, of course, among many investigators within the cohort is are the regimens themselves, because they do have side effects that often accompany them. So not only do they treat the HIV infection, but some of the integrase inhibitors, for example, do increase body weight. They increase cardiovascular disease risk. So some of the research that we do is not only related to the HIV infection itself, but the treatments and some of the side effects that do come with those treatments in relationship to aging and other aging-related outcomes, like cardiovascular disease. The next slide, please. Concomitant with effective antiretroviral therapies, we do see, of course, reductions in viral load, such that the majority of our participants today have what would be considered an undetectable viral load, which is at least 20 HIV RNA copies per mil or less. And you can see that trend, there's been a clear shift over time in terms of viral load, again, due to the effective treatment. Next slide, please. And corresponding to that, we see a higher proportion of individuals presenting with a CD4 count of at least 500. So again, MWCCS is a natural history type of cohort. It has been within both the MACS and the WIHS, and so we were able to monitor these kinds of trends over time and the influence and impact of the therapy for HIV infection. Next slide, please. We also monitor co-infections. That's been an interest among many people within the MWCCS over time. We track Hep C or hepatitis C virus as well as hepatitis B. And that's an interesting thing to note because 20% of our women with HIV infection, for example, have a co-infection of combined both HIV and hepatitis C virus. That's compared to 9% of the men. But these are some of the things that we can continue to look at into the future and to see how not only the HIV infection, but the fact or the presence of more than one infectious disease might influence the aging process. Next slide, please. So I've already shown you, you can already kind of assume what some of our routinely collected measures are, I hope, by some of those data that describe the characteristics of the participants. But I want to tell you a little bit more. There's other things that we do measure. Next slide, please. Because we measure a lot. All of our participants come in for a day, and during that day they do a lot of stuff. They participate in a lot of measures. So you've seen some of them, as I mentioned already. We have a variety of different aging outcomes that we look at. We do physical performance measures, which not only include the ones that are considered as part of the freed frailty phenotype, but we also do chair stands as well as standing balance tests. So components of the short physical performance battery, for those of you who are familiar with that. In terms of our neuro women and the men, to allow us to understand those outcomes as people age, as well as preclinical potential dementia types of profiles. We measure attitudes and beliefs, healthcare utilization, quality of life. The participants have completed the Centers for Epidemiological Studies Depressive Symptom Inventory over time. Every 6 months, we have a SESD on these people, and we're doing more intensive mental health assessments in the MWCCS. We measure substance use and sexual behaviors, medical conditions, medications, and at every visit, they have a blood drawn. They might actually also donate a urine specimen as well as other types of samples, and I'll discuss those in the next slide. So we have a lot of biospecimens that are collected. We have a repository that's kept. The participants, it includes a physical examination. So these are related to some of the measures that I just described to you: body weight, body height. We do impedance to get at body composition. We measure, of course, blood pressures, diastolic, systolic blood pressures, and those types of things. We've been very interested in outcomes verification and adjudication. As I mentioned before, we are connected to the SEER registry for cancers. We're also connected to the renal registry for renal outcomes. Given that our primary or our lead institution for the MWCCS is NHLBI, which is the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, we are now doing extensive, and given the age of the participants, we are now doing extensive cardiovascular and cerebrovascular outcomes verification and adjudication with the MWCCS. And so we'll be having better data related to that coming into the future. The other thing that I wanted to mention for those of you who come from different backgrounds is that the MWCCS is co-funded by 13 institutes in the NIH. We, NIA, NIDS, NIDDK, NIMH. We have a variety of potential options for you. If you're interested in doing a research study, you should check to your favorite institute and look for RFAs that have to relate to chronic HIV and aging, because you're probably going to find an RFA within your institute of choice. So I would encourage you to look there for those types of opportunities. Next slide, please. And these are some of the types of specimens that we have in our central repository that we've been collecting over time. So we have quite a bit in the repository, not only related to blood, but we do have cells, cell pellets, Like I said, we collect a urine, store that. We do cervical vaginal lavage in the women. There's some saliva stored, stool. We have extensive microbiome studies going on at the moment. Semen has been collected in the men. We've had hair collected in the women that are available at certain clinical research sites. So we have quite a bit of biospecimen available. If you have an idea that would require, you know, a new biomarker to be measured in plasma and serum, wherever, that we probably have a sample for you to use. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, because NHLBI is our lead institute, we have been preparing for the MWCCS by doing some baseline measures of various cardiovascular disease measures. They include ECGs, ZO patch was done in the men, pulmonary function tests, echoes, as well as sleep studies done in the MACS and a sub-study done in the WIHS. So we have at least, for some of these measures, over 2,000 participants worth of data related to these particular cardiovascular disease related measures. Next slide. So that's the overview. That's the overview of the MWCCS. We have a lot of data over time. It's an ideal resource for, especially for junior investigators, for people getting started in their careers. If you are interested in, you know, addressing an idea, whether it's a secondary data analysis idea, whether you have an idea about a new biomarker that you want to explore, this is really just a really nice sandbox for you to start playing in. And the way that it works is that if you have an idea, you do what we call fill out a concept sheet. So the next slide, please. That's the first step in the process, is to submit a concept sheet. And we do have a study website that's available to you. It's called MWCCS.org. And this is the website that's going to give you all the information that you need to be able to do what you want to do if you would like to work within the cohort. Next slide, please. This is the homepage for MWCCS.org, and there are a variety of tabs across the top. I'm going to go through those briefly so that you can see what's located within each tab. Next slide, please. So you have an idea. You want to fill out a concept sheet. What is your first step? Well, you need to become familiar with the concept sheet and with the process, and I'm going to, as I said, walk you through that. But the other thing that we require is that if you are not an MWCCS investigator or, you know, affiliated with an MWCCS clinical research site, you should have an MWCCS liaison. And so what that is, that person is someone who is affiliated with the MWCCS, is ideally an investigator, right? And this person is going to help you navigate your way through the process. So if you are in need of a certain type of data, a certain type of sample, biospecimen, this person will help you better understand if those types of data exist or if those types of biospecimens exist, such that you can actually even pursue your idea within the cohort. This liaison will also help you check. We have a keyword search engine that's available just to investigators, such that we can look for overlap in concept sheets for you. So let's say you have one idea and somebody within the MWCCS is already doing it. We can identify that. It will save you a lot of time and effort. You won't recreate the wheel or get scooped. And perhaps we can help you carve out something related to it, and in the process you could get to meet the investigators within the MWCCS who are working on similar topics, perhaps identify potential collaborators and start building your research base within the cohort. The liaison also makes sure that the people with the appropriate scientific expertise are involved with you in your process, and we also as liaisons confirm that you're adherent to concept sheet and publication policies, and I'll show you where those are on the website in a minute. So it might be that you have a liaison or you know somebody within the MWCCS who can help you in that regard. That's great. If you don't, you can contact the Data Administration Coordination Center, which is mwccs@jhu.edu, and tell them about yourself and your idea and that you would like to identify a liaison. Next slide, please. So you want to submit a concept sheet. We revert to that. Click on the Investigator Info tab is your first step. Next slide, please. When you click on this tab, what you will see is this page, at least part of it. And there will be a link here for submitting a concept sheet. And so you would click there, and under that link, within that link, you're going to find a sample concept sheet, which you actually have access to here as part of this webinar. It's attached. That is very important for you to become familiar with before you submit a concept sheet. There are also links here for submitting revised concept sheets if that's what needs to happen, if you're going to amend your concept sheet. If your concept sheet is approved and now you need to request data or specimens, that is also here. And then we also have policies and procedures for submitting manuscripts or abstracts, as well as for publication. So what I want to bring out at the beginning is that if you requested data from all sites, for example, what we do is we assign a co-author from every clinical research site to your paper. And that's to acknowledge the time and the effort and the scientific expertise that's gone along with creating this data set, that you would be acknowledge the participants that have participated at each clinical research site. It's very important that you get the information from all of the investigators that have been involved. And so we have policies such as that. So they relate to co-authorship. They relate to if you have an abstract that you want to submit for a meeting, we does require that all co-authors preview it first, and that the EC or the executive committee of the MWCCS also previews your abstract. We try to find that, but you want to allow that extra lead time prior to an abstract being the deadline for the abstract to allow the EC to review the abstract. And similar types of policies exist for publications, etc. So you can look at this at your own leisure. Next slide, please. The next tab across the top is policies and publications. And again, there's more about what you can read related to what I just talked about, and you can have fun clicking and reading. So that's about all I will say here, except to say that there are, these are all important information here, but one of the things you might be interested in if you're new to the MACS and the WIHS is we do have two links here under publications, where you can actually look at lists of the historical WIHS and MACS publications so that you can actually get a feel for what types of analyses, what types of reports, publications are out there for the MWCCS as WIHS and MACS. And then the other link that's on this site is the dossier, and actually many of the slides that are included in my presentation today did come from this dossier. There are a few more that are included here, so you can actually go online, you can go see the dossier yourself and what additional information is there. Next slide, please. Working groups. If you remember from the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned that there are over 30 scientific and operational working groups. These working groups are very important for you if you're going to come to the MWCCS with an idea that you want to do research on, because there's probably a working group that's there just for you. And we're lucky because aging starts with an A, so we're at the top of the list here, but we have working groups on topics that include aging, cardiovascular disease, you can see here, pulmonary, genetics, metabolics, behavioral, neuropsychology. We've got working groups that cover most of the major areas of scientific inquiry that are pursued within the MWCCS. So if you have an idea related to cardiovascular disease and you submit a concept sheet, on that concept sheet, as I'll show you, you are allowed to check a box for a working group that will review your concept sheet. And therefore, you will have individuals within the cohort who will have the most expertise related to the review of your ideas. So it's a very nice way to get familiar with the science that's ongoing within the MWCCS if you actually take a look through these working groups and the simple paragraphs that describe what these working groups focus on. Next slide, please. And finally, the final tab I'll discuss is the directory, and you can go here to take a look at who's all involved in the MWCCS. It might help you identify a liaison if you recognize a name, but in any case, all PIs and the project directors as well as their locations are listed here. Next slide, please. So submitting a concept sheet. So what I've done within this presentation, so you have this in two places, is you actually have each page of the concept sheet in this presentation as well as in the attached PDF. It's the same thing. These next slides are exactly the same as the concept submission form sample that is linked to this webinar. So we're just going to scroll through here, and what you're going to see is that by looking through these pages of the concept sheet, you will be prepared when you go to submit your concept sheet what types of information you will be required to provide. So again, things like if you're requesting specimens, what types of specimens. If you want a specific working group to review, here's on this page, you can see there's a whole list of every working group, and you will be asked to select one, maybe maximum 2 working groups that would be most appropriate for reviewing your concept sheet. This page, for example, is asking about whether you're going to try to apply for funding for your concept, whether this concept might relate to you obtaining some preliminary data that will go toward preparation for the grant. So it asks you details about that. If there's an RFA number, you can put that here, the submission deadline, etc. That gives us an idea of what your goals are with these data. Next page, and the next page. The next page shows you here, this is where you start uploading your actual concept. You copy and paste your abstract into this box, copy and paste your specific aims into this box. You upload your research plan, and if it's a revised research plan, then you upload a letter to the executive committee telling them, okay, this is what I did in response to the reviewer comments. Please note that there are word limits for some of these items, and so it's good to be familiar with this. Take a look at the other instructions. There's a link for that on the website, so that you kind of really are prepared when you go online to submit everything. You've got all your ducks in a row, and you don't get caught with something you don't have. It's just nice to be able to follow this through before you go to submit. Next slide, please. This is the sample specifications. If you are wanting to get access to samples, these are the types of, this is what you're asked to check, which kind you want. If you are not asking for specimens, you skip this part, so it doesn't apply to you. Next page, please. And then we do have certain samples that are more special. For example, elite survivors. Maybe you're interested in incident cancers of a specific type. If that's what it is, you can choose to check one of these boxes. Next slide, please. And then finally, the last page of the concept sheet submission form is that just acknowledgement that you've read through the policies and the guidelines, and that you're aware of them and that you will abide by them. These are a lot of data that have been collected over a long time by a lot of very experienced investigators, and the data have been contributed by very loyal and adherent participants. And so we want to acknowledge the fact that respect for that process over time is acknowledged by you as the investigator and your use of the data, and that you will maintain confidentiality and so forth. And so we just want to make sure that you are aware of these particular points and that you sign and date this particular page of the document. Next slide. Once you submit a concept sheet, here's what happens. It's going to be sent to the working group that you selected for review. The working groups have been charged that they should only spend 10 business days for the reviews, so you should get back your responses relatively quickly. If you've requested a specimen, there will be a mandatory lab review, and if you've requested that you want a survey added to the protocol or anything of that nature, then there is a necessary project director review. These are the people who actually oversee the clinical activities at each clinical research site. Then there's a decision. The decision by the working group is whether it's approved, rejected, or request a revision. I have never seen a concept sheet rejected. I've seen them approved, and I've seen them a request for revision. And so if it's approved, that's great. Then you would go to that to the link that I showed you before where you request data or specimens. You would go to that link and you would fill in a form related to, okay, here's the data I want, here are the specimens that I need. And again, this is another place where your liaison can help you tremendously in terms of understanding how to upload the variables you want, what types of variable names you might need to be able to get at the data that you desire. And if you've been requested to revise your concept sheet, you would do that according to the comments that you've received. And like I mentioned, you write a letter to the EC saying, here's how I've addressed the comments. It's good to actually create a revised concept sheet highlighting the areas that you have revised to reflect the comments, and then you upload that, and there's a link for that as well. Next slide. So that is the MWCCS. I think I probably went through this fairly quickly, and I hope you learned a lot about who we are. Next slide, please. I would just encourage all of you, I've provided on the last slide here my contact information. You can certainly contact me. I am the Aging Working Group co-chair, and I have served as a liaison for external investigators over the last years, and so I'm happy to help or to answer any kinds of questions. You can also choose, as I mentioned in one of the previous slides, there's another email, which is mwccs@jhu.edu, so you could choose also to email that particular contact point if you need additional help. But I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Deb. What a beautiful presentation. And I do realize we have run out of time, but people are still on the line. So just a quick reminder that you can type and send questions using that questions feature in the dashboard. You probably see that on the right-hand side of your screen. We're not using that raised hand feature today. So please, if you have a question and you can still hang on the line for a couple more minutes, please use that questions panel to submit. And again, just a friendly reminder, we're recording the session, so we'll send you that access link by email when it's available. So while people are thinking about a question or looking at their dashboard for that questions panel, Deb, I was wondering maybe if we want to go back to a helpful slide you showed at the beginning, just a quick kind of overview of the characteristics of the sample, with such as what's the average age of the people that were followed and how long they were followed.
Sure, that sounds good. I mean, one of the greatest aspects of this particular cohort study is, as I mentioned, the range of measures. Not only do we have self-reported outcomes that are related to aging, like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, hypertension, but we also have the clinical measures to correspond to it. So we have the blood pressures measured, we have the blood lipid levels, we have HbA1c for diabetes. So from that standpoint, it becomes extremely powerful for looking at aging-related outcomes, because whether that's your outcome or your exposure, you're getting a very good look at what it is, right? What the phenotype is. And so, and given the average age of our participants, we're at the age now where we're looking at people we've never ever been able to look at before in an epidemiological setting. People with HIV infection have never lived to these older ages. And there's no other studies that can parallel this. So this really is an interesting opportunity to look not only at traditional chronic disease risk factors, but the infectious aspect of things as well.
Great. Well, thank you. We have run out of time, and Deb, it's been a real pleasure learning about the combined cohort study. So thank you to everyone for participating. This is the end of the program.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.